Some roads lead to nowhere, and some take you places you can never come back from. The highway stretched like a vein through the heart of Florida, winding through the swamps, the dense woods, and the forgotten small towns that seemed to sink into the landscape like graves. It was a road that felt heavy with the weight of all those who had traveled it, with the shadows of all who had gone missing, their faces plastered on posters that flapped in the wind, soon forgotten. And along that dark stretch of asphalt, a new kind of predator was hunting, a woman with a gun in her hand and a lifetime of rage burning in her eyes. Her name was Aileen Wuornos, and for a time, she became America's first female serial killer. Aileen had been born under a bad sign, or at least that's what she believed. From the beginning, her life had been a series of dark roads, leading her deeper and deeper into the shadows. Born in Rochester, Michigan, to a broken family, her father was a convicted child molester who would never meet his daughter. He hung himself in prison when she was only a toddler. Her mother abandoned her shortly thereafter, leaving her and her brother to be raised by their grandparents, who treated them with a coldness that felt like winter on their skin. Her grandfather's rage was like a storm, violent, unpredictable. Her grandmother, numb and distant, slowly faded into alcoholism, leaving Aileen to fend for herself. By the age of 11, Aileen was selling herself for cigarettes, for food, for anything that might numb the pain. She found solace in the woods, in the cold emptiness of nature, where she could scream and rage without anyone hearing, where she could cry until her throat was raw. She learned to survive, to build walls around her heart so thick that no one could break through. But that loneliness was a fire that burned inside her, driving her to seek out the very things that would destroy her. The years that followed were a blur of petty crimes, arrests, and brief stints in jail. She drifted through life like a ghost, hitchhiking from state to state, her thumb out, her face hardened against the sun and wind. She took up with men who promised her love, but gave her only more pain. She learned that trust was a currency she could not afford, that love was a lie told to children, that kindness was a weakness she could no longer afford. But then she met Tyria Moore, a hotel maid in Daytona Beach, and for a moment, Aileen felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Tyria was different. She was soft where Aileen was hard, calm where Aileen was chaos. They became lovers, inseparable, bound together by a shared need, a shared loneliness. Aileen believed that, with Tyria, she could find a way out of the darkness. They drifted together from place to place, scraping by on Aileen's small-time hustles, living in seedy motels, sleeping in cars, and dreaming of a better life they would never have. But dreams die hard, and Aileen's dreams were no different. The reality of their poverty, the weight of their pasts, and the constant threat of being caught pushed Aileen to the edge. The anger that had been simmering inside her since childhood began to boil, began to spill over, and soon it found its outlet on the highways of Florida. It started with Richard Mallory, a man who offered her a ride, perhaps thinking her another lost soul in need of saving. But Aileen had stopped looking for saviors. The details of what happened next would change with every retelling, but the end result was the same. Mallory was found dead, shot multiple times, his body dumped in the woods, left to be consumed by the wild things. And Aileen felt a strange sense of relief, a release of pressure, as if all the years of pain and rage had found a voice in the sound of that gunshot. But it didn't stop with Mallory. Over the next year, 6 more men would pick up Aileen Wuornos along the dark stretches of highway, and 6 more men would meet the same fate. David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burris, Dick Humphreys, Peter Seams, Walter Geno Antonio. Each of them found dead, their bodies riddled with bullets, their faces twisted in the final moments of fear. She would later say they had tried to hurt her, to rape her, that she was acting in self-defense, but her words were as twisted as the lives she had taken. Each kill left a mark on Aileen, a scar across her soul, but she continued on, driven by a force she couldn't control, by a hatred that seemed to fill her like a dark tide. She drank to forget, to numb the edges of her reality. She would sit in dingy bars nursing cheap whiskey, her eyes hollow, her hands shaking. Sometimes she would laugh, a strange, high-pitched cackle that sent chills down the spines of those who heard it. Other times she would cry, her tears hot and angry, as if she were cursing the very gods for the life she had been given. The police were closing in, following the trail of bodies she left behind like breadcrumbs in the dark. Witnesses saw her driving the cars of the victims, pawning their belongings, telling stories that didn't add up. And all the while, Tyria watched from the sidelines, her own fear growing with each new body found. She loved Aileen, but she feared her more. She knew that it was only a matter of time before the law caught up with them. And then it happened. In January 1991, Aileen was arrested at a biker bar, The Last Resort, fittingly named, just outside of Daytona Beach. The police had their woman, but they needed a confession. They turned to Tyria, playing on her fear, her desire to escape the darkness that had become her life. Tyria agreed to cooperate, to wear a wire, to coax a confession out of Aileen. And Aileen, desperate for love, desperate to hold on to the one person who had ever mattered to her, confessed. She confessed to everything. The trial was a spectacle, a media frenzy that turned Aileen Wuornos into a household name. She sat in court, her face a mask of defiance, her eyes darting from side to side, as if she were looking for a way out, an escape from the reality closing in around her. She ranted and raved, accused the police of framing her, claimed that God himself had directed her hand. But the jury saw through her lies, saw the darkness that lay just beneath her skin, and they convicted her of murder. In 2002, after over a decade on death row, Aileen was executed by lethal injection. As she lay strapped to the gurney, she stared at the ceiling, her face calm, her voice steady. Her last words were a mix of defiance and madness, claiming she would be back with Jesus, that she'd return in a spaceship, that the end of the world was near. And then the poison entered her veins, and her eyes closed, and Aileen Wuornos, the damsel of death, slipped into the darkness she had known all her life. But her story didn't end there. The questions lingered like ghosts on the highway. Was she a victim turned predator, or was she always a killer at heart? Did the men she killed deserve to die, or were they just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Was Aileen Wuornos a monster, or a product of a monstrous world? The road stretches on, the shadows growing longer as night falls. And somewhere out there in the darkness, Aileen's spirit still roams, still hitchhiking, still searching for the one thing she could never find: peace. And those who drive that road late at night sometimes swear they see her. A figure on the side of the highway, her thumb out, her eyes dark and hollow, waiting for someone to stop, waiting for another chance, another story to be told.